Like many events in life, this story didn't begin in a particularly original way. A man woke up on the floor in an empty room. He remembered nothing about himself except for his name, Myron. It seemed unusual to him, though, to be fair, he had nothing to compare it to. He simply didn't know any other names. Myron stood up and looked around. Concrete walls without windows, a low ceiling with a dim light bulb, a closed wooden door, and a mirror hanging beside it, as if inviting him to come closer, to see what he looked like. He stepped forward and saw his reflection. A pale, gaunt face, light-colored hair sticking out in all directions as if a comb hadn't touched it in ages, and gray eyes staring back at him with confusion and detachment. How old was he? He looked to be around 30, but did age even matter when he couldn't remember how he ended up in this room, and his appearance triggered no memories? A noise came from beyond the wall, footsteps and barely discernible voices. After a moment's hesitation, Myron flung the door open and stepped into a dimly lit corridor, where men and women of various ages were hurrying about. They were dressed just like him in gray pants and shirts. With fearful expressions, they frantically opened the doors lining both sides of the seemingly endless corridor and quickly disappeared inside, as if the slightest delay could cost them their lives. "What's going on?" Myron asked a bald man who was nervously yanking at the handle of a nearby door. "Skreks," the man blurted out, looking deranged. "The Skreks are coming." The bald man yanked at the handle again. It was stuck, refusing to budge. Then, shoving Myron aside, he darted into his room. Myron lunged after him, but the door slammed shut right in front of his face. He grabbed the handle. It was locked. "Open up. That's my room." From inside came hysterical laughter. The bald man was clearly pleased with how cleverly he had hidden himself from the danger. But what danger was he talking about? As if in response to Myron's thoughts, a clicking sound echoed from deep within the corridor, so sharp and piercing that a chill ran down his spine, and his heart skipped a beat. The monstrous noise grew louder with each passing second. Whatever was making it was fast, big, and undoubtedly dangerous. But what exactly? Myron couldn't see, as the far end of the corridor was shrouded in darkness, from which the clicking emanated. "Don't just stand there, run!" A high-pitched voice rang out behind him. Myron turned. A girl stood before him. Like the other inhabitants of this strange place, she wore loose-fitting pants and a shirt that barely concealed her thin frame. He noticed her dark, messy hair, as if cut in a fit of rage, and her eyes, glowing like embers in the dim corridor light. Where had she come from? He had seen everyone else hide in the rooms. "Run," the girl repeated urgently. "They like it." She said something else, but Myron didn't catch it. His ears were drowned out by a deafening, chittering roar behind him. He spun around sharply. Dark figures emerged from the shadows at the end of the corridor, towering to the ceiling, with elongated, oily bodies and multiple jointed limbs. They resembled monstrous insects born from the fevered mind of an entomophobic. The Skreks. Myron was sure that's what they were. Had heads composed of bulging, glowing yellow eyes and massive mandibles bristling with rows of jagged teeth. Their jaws never stopped moving, producing that otherworldly clicking. Upon spotting Myron, the creatures froze for a moment, like predators before the pounce, their long-awaited prey in sight. Then, with terrifying speed, they lunged forward, their tubular limbs propelling them down the corridor. Myron bolted in the opposite direction, realizing with shock that the girl had already vanished. She must have hidden in one of the rooms. "Open up!" Myron banged on doors as he ran, yanking at handles, but no one responded to his desperate cries. The corridor ended in a fork. Two more endless hallways stretched out in opposite directions, dimly lit, lined with doors. Myron glanced back. The Skreks were closing in. There was no time to think. Did it even matter which way he went when he had no idea where either path led? He dashed into the right corridor, running as fast as his legs would carry him. After several minutes, he reached another junction. He turned right again. Feeling the creatures on his heels, the clicking grew louder. His breath came in ragged gasps. His pounding heart and relentless sprint through the maze of hallways were taking their toll. Finally, he reached yet another intersection. Without thinking, he turned right and froze in place. A few meters ahead, he saw a sight that sent ice through his veins. 3 Skreks were tearing a man apart, sinking their mandibles hungrily into his mutilated body. He wasn't screaming, he was already dead. Who could have survived such wounds? Severed limbs lay scattered on the floor, and a bald head with a crushed skull lolled lifelessly as the creatures feverishly ripped into his chest cavity. A bald head. When Myron's heart started pounding again, he realized it was the same bald man who had locked himself in his room. As vile as the stranger's betrayal had been, he certainly hadn't deserved this fate. But how had he ended up here if he had hidden in Myron's room? There was no time to wonder. Myron slowly backed away, eyes locked on the feasting Skreks. They paid him no mind, too engrossed in devouring their meal. The clicking from the hallway behind him grew louder. The other Skreks were still approaching. He had only one option: to take the other path, the one free of monsters. At least he hoped it was. The new corridor was empty, and soon he reached yet another junction. The building seemed to be an endless labyrinth of hallways lined with closed doors. Trying to catch his breath, Myron decided to turn left this time, fully expecting to see another long corridor. But to his surprise, he found a spiral staircase with wooden steps. Looking closer, he noticed dark stains, dried blood. He hesitated, torn between 2 choices: ascend the staircase or keep running through the maze of corridors. The answer came quickly. As the clicking sounds of the approaching Skreks echoed from both hallways, Myron rushed up the stairs. Climbing the spiraling steps, he stumbled repeatedly. His legs, exhausted from running, no longer obeyed him. His head spun, his heart pounded against his ribs, and his mouth was dry, but he stubbornly continued his ascent. Soon, the staircase made one final turn and abruptly ended. Before him lay a dimly lit attic with slanted ceilings and wooden beams, cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and various junk. Among the scattered objects, he spotted a rusty child's bicycle, stacks of books, and an ancient computer with a bulky monitor. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams like funeral shrouds, and the air was so thick with dust that Myron's nose itched. At the far end of the attic, a round dormer window glowed with an eerie, shimmering light, shifting between blue and green, as if an aurora burned just outside. A noise erupted from the staircase, the sharp chittering of Skreks, mixed with the tapping of thin limbs against wooden steps. Glancing down, Myron saw them climbing in a line up the spiral staircase. Just a little longer, and they'd be on the attic floor. He sprinted to the dormer window and yanked the handle, throwing it open. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed his worst fear. Several Skreks had already crawled into the attic and were closing in on him. Myron pulled himself up, squeezing through the window. It was just wide enough for a person to fit through. A cold wind lashed against his face, tousling his hair. Clutching onto a drain pipe, he stepped onto a narrow ledge that ran along the edge of the building's attic. He froze in shock. All around him stretched an endless void, illuminated by vivid bursts of green, blue, and violet, as if the very darkness pulsed with an otherworldly glow. It seemed as though the massive brick building, with Myron teetering on its ledge, was floating in a boundless cosmos. His gaze was swallowed by nebulas shimmering with fantastical lights at the edges of the universe. A jagged Skrek limb shot out of the dormer window, resembling a twisted, withered branch. Myron gasped in terror. His grip slipped, and he tumbled off the ledge, plunging into the abyss. For a fleeting moment, he simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the eternal darkness, erased from reality as if his very existence had been meaningless and undefined from the start. He came to on the floor of the room. Opening his eyes, he saw the same ceiling with the dim light bulb, the same bare concrete walls, the same wooden door. Myron sat up, feeling a strange lightness in his body, as though there had been no exhausting chase through endless corridors, no plunge into the abyss from the attic. He still remembered nothing about himself and had no idea how he had ended up back in the room where his life had begun the day before. But had it really been yesterday? Wondering how long he had been unconscious, Myron got to his feet and moved toward the door, glancing at the mirror out of habit. What he saw made him freeze. A man in his 40s stared back at him. His appearance was drastically different from what he had seen the day before. Short dark hair, a broad, weathered face covered in thick stubble, and narrowed brown eyes. Everything had changed. Even his height seemed slightly different. But how was that possible? He ran a hand over his face, trying to confirm that the reflection was not deceiving him, when suddenly, he heard a quiet creak of the door. In the narrow gap by the doorframe, he spotted the outline of a face. Rushing forward, he yanked the door open, revealing the girl, the same stranger who had urged him to run from the Skreks. Caught off guard, she flinched in surprise. Myron noticed that, unlike him, her appearance had not changed at all. And when he looked at her pale face, a strange ache blossomed in his chest, as if an old wound had just been torn open. "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to spy on you," she said with a guilty smile. "But that's exactly what you were doing." Myron glanced down the corridor. It was empty. No frantic strangers, no insect-like monsters. "I just wanted to make sure you woke up," she explained. But Myron didn't let her finish. He grabbed her arm, pulled her into the room, and shut the door behind them. "What is this place?" he demanded. "What the hell is going on here? And why do I look completely different?" He bombarded the stranger with questions, not taking his eyes off her bewildered face. She seemed taken aback by his behavior. "You used to act differently?" "And barely remembered anything," the girl mused. Then, as if struck by sudden realization, she gave a cautious smile. "That means they've started watching you. You've become interesting to them. That's why you woke up today unharmed. And why you remember what happened yesterday. Who are they?" Myron crossed his arms, trying to mask his unease. His head buzzed from the flood of information. "You mean the Skreks? The creatures that chased me through the hallways?" The girl answered in a whisper, as if afraid someone might overhear. "They're far more dangerous than the Skreks. If they like you, they'll watch you. But only for as long as it amuses them." "What does that mean?" "It means you exist only as long as they are watching." Myron instinctively scanned the walls and ceiling, searching for surveillance cameras, but found none. He shook his head. Her explanation made no sense. It sounded like the ramblings of a madwoman. Or maybe that was the real answer. Maybe they were simply in a mental asylum, and all the monstrous creatures, the cosmic void, and the memory lapses were nothing more than side effects of the drugs forced upon them by the doctors. He almost voiced this thought but hesitated and instead asked, "Are they people?" The girl nodded cautiously. "How many of them?" She shrugged and said thoughtfully, "It varies. Sometimes just one, other times several at once. But they always watch. There may be days, years, or even an eternity when no one observes you. But then, someone starts watching again. And then you live again." Myron exhaled, closing his eyes. He was now certain the girl had lost her mind from being trapped in this strange place. Did that mean the same fate awaited him? To mutter insane theories about mysterious beings secretly observing the prisoners of this labyrinthine house? Is this some kind of experiment? He finally asked. Are we test subjects? The girl smiled sadly. You always ask that question. And every time I answer, no, this is not an experiment. Sometimes you ask if this is a psychiatric hospital, and I tell you the same thing. No, it's not an asylum and we're not insane. Myron stared at her, startled by her ability to read his thoughts. And no, I can't read your mind, she added with that same sorrowful smile. Sometimes you remember what I've told you, and other times you forget. This has happened countless times, and will keep happening as long as they are watching us. All right, Myron agreed irritably. He still had many questions, and he wanted answers, no matter how absurd they sounded coming from her lips. What is this house? And how do you explain the change in my appearance? Why did I wake up with a different face? The girl bit her lower lip and closed her eyes, looking truly exhausted. Like this conversation had repeated itself so many times that it had begun to wear on her. The house belongs to the source, and we are its property. You woke up with a different appearance because you're still in the process of being created. The source hasn't decided what you should be yet. I've seen these changes happen many times. Sometimes you look strong and determined, other times lost and confused, like you did yesterday. It's not just your face that changes. It's your entire personality. She fell silent, then, studying Myron intently, added softly, but today you're different. For the first time, you remember what happened before. Her words only deepened the mystery. Questions multiplied in his mind, and a strange emptiness settled in his chest. He wanted to ask about the source, but before he could, a piercing chittering sound echoed from the hallway. Skrex! The girl's face twisted in horror. They're coming! She lunged for the door, locking it just as a blood-curdling scream rang out. A prisoner being torn apart. Myron shuddered at the sound, remembering how the Skrex had ripped open the bald man yesterday. Quick! We need to barricade the door, the girl commanded urgently. With what? Myron looked around. The room was completely empty. The girl dashed toward the side wall, and Myron's breath caught when he saw a massive wardrobe and a chair beside it. But they hadn't been there before. Don't just stand there. Help me. The girl, flushed with exertion, was already pushing the wardrobe. Myron snapped out of his shock and rushed to assist. After a few moments of grunting effort, they shoved the heavy wardrobe against the door. The chittering beyond the wall grew louder by the second. As Myron and the girl stepped back to the middle of the room, something massive and powerful slammed against the barricade with a deafening thud. The blows came one after another, accompanied by a terrifying, rage-fueled chittering. The creature pounding against the door was going mad with hunger. The wardrobe trembled with each impact, and Myron prayed that the antique piece of furniture would withstand the monster's assault. The Skrex won't stop until they get to you, the girl cried, glancing at Myron. Her face had turned ashen with fear, her eyes brimming with terror. They will hunt you because they enjoy it. Who are they? Who the hell are they? Myron exploded, exhausted by the constant evasions. The relentless pounding and the creature's screeching had worn his nerves to the limit. The girl grabbed his hand, her palm was ice cold. He noticed, and pulled him toward the wall where a lone chair stood. You have to escape, she said, throwing a frightened glance at the wardrobe. It had shifted several centimeters after another brutal hit. The source has all the answers. You must find it. How? Myron spread his arms wide. We're in a locked room with no windows. How am I supposed to get out? Through the ventilation shaft. She pointed upward, and Myron followed her gaze. High up on the wall, just beneath the ceiling, A wide opening covered by a metal grate loomed in the dim light. He couldn't be sure if it had been there before. Maybe he had simply overlooked it, but a far more likely explanation struck him. Just like the furniture, the vent had appeared the moment the girl spoke of it. Myron lowered his gaze and nearly gasped in shock. The girl was gone. He didn't even have time to process how that was possible before a powerful crash against the door sent the wardrobe skidding half a meter across the floor. With a furious screech, the Skrek squeezed through the gap. Its head swayed from side to side, mandibles spread wide in predatory anticipation as it searched for its prey. Myron had no choice. He leaped onto the chair and grabbed the grate covering the vent. A few desperate yanks, and the bolts securing the bars popped out of the wall. To Myron's surprise, tearing off the grate was far easier than he had expected. He turned just in time to see the Skrek, its eyes burning red like embers, slowly creeping toward him, hesitating as if afraid to scare him off. That brief pause was all Myron needed. He hurled the grate at the creature and, pulling himself up with all his strength, scrambled into the ventilation shaft. Inside the dark tunnel, unexpectedly wide, the air reeked of damp rot, the stench so overwhelming that nausea twisted in his gut. Fighting the urge to gag, Myron crawled forward on all fours, his palms scraping against the rough surface of the passage. He glanced back, just in time to see the Skrek's head push through the opening. The creature thrashed in frustration, unable to squeeze its bulky, many-limbed body into the narrow space. Myron kept moving, forcing himself to take shallow breaths. The nauseating stench only intensified with every meter, thickening into an almost toxic miasma. Periodically, he passed ventilation grates, through which stale air trickled in and faint strips of light spilled onto the floor and walls. The openings led into other rooms. Yesterday, terrified men and women had hidden there from the Skreks. But now they stood empty, so Myron didn't waste time investigating. He focused on his last directive from the girl: find the mysterious source, the key to all answers. Soon, he noticed the tunnel's texture had changed. The floor became soft, spongy, and damp, as if coated in some kind of mucus that stung his palms and soaked into his knees. The walls and ceiling had transformed as well. Now they were smooth, glistening with secretions, resembling the fleshy interior of some colossal intestine. A few meters ahead, as the tunnel bent at a sharp 90-degree angle, Myron encountered the source of the unbearable stench. In the dim light filtering through the grates, a gruesome blockade came into view, a tangled mass of corpses clogging the passage. A wave of nausea surged through him at the sight of the half-rotted remains, their tattered shirts and trousers clinging to decomposing flesh. He wanted to get a closer look at their faces but recoiled in horror. Their heads, slick with mucus, had been reduced to shapeless, pulpy masses where flesh had melted away, exposing the yellowed bones of their skulls. Gasping for air, Myron pressed his face against the nearest vent, inhaling deeply. Even the stale, musty air from the room beyond felt fresh compared to the sickening stench of decay that filled the tunnel. How many of them were here? How long had they been lying in the tunnel? What had killed them? What was the strange slime covering their remains? Questions ricocheted through Myron's mind, but one thought stood out as the most obvious conclusion. He wasn't the first person to crawl through this shaft. Lost in thought, he was slow to notice the tunnel walls shifting, contracting like the insides of a colossal worm, slowly closing in as thick mucus dripped from the ceiling. Fat drops splattered onto Myron's skin, burning wherever they touched. His face, neck, and hands flared with irritation. Scrambling over the corpses, Myron suddenly realized with horror that they had fallen victim to the house itself. It was digesting them, breaking them down with its acidic mucus, as if they were trapped inside a living organism. The passage continued to shrink. Another moment, and the wet walls of the shaft would seal completely, crushing him. The line of corpses was nearing its end when Myron halted by the last one, startled by a faint, wheezing breath escaping from the corpse's slightly parted lips. It lay sprawled on its back, arms spread wide, its chest barely rising with weak, labored breaths. Myron hesitated. Should he move closer or keep going before the tunnel sealed completely? The dying man rasped again. Cursing under his breath, Myron crawled toward him. A second later, he froze in horror. In the dim light, he could finally make out the face of the living corpse. The acidic mucus had eaten away patches of skin on the cheeks and forehead, exposing raw muscle and bone. But there was no doubt. Just yesterday, this face had belonged to Myron himself. He recognized it from his reflection in the mirror. The same gauntness, the same pale complexion, the same distant gray eyes, the same tousled light hair. As if confirming his worst fears, the corpse rasped, "You are me. How is this possible?" Myron exhaled, watching as his own past self licked his cracked lips, crusted with dried blood. "You don't have much time," the doppelganger wheezed. "Finish what we couldn't." A chilling realization struck Myron like a hammer. He turned to look at the bodies behind him. They were all his duplicates, previous versions of himself that had perished in failed attempts to pass through the tunnel. How many had there been? How many tries? The rasping voice of his past self pulled him back to the present. "You're close to the source. Don't stop. They like it." "Who are they?" Myron finally snapped, his voice rising in frustration. The tunnel walls kept closing in, his breaths coming shorter, and there was no time left for cryptic half-answers. "Who are they?" "You'll make it through as long as they're watching," the doppelganger murmured. Then, with a ragged gasp, he arched his head back in a final death spasm. Myron shook him by the shoulders in a futile attempt to rouse him, but the body slumped lifelessly. As he pulled away, his fingers brushed against something solid in the corpse's shirt pocket. After a brief hesitation, he reached inside and retrieved a folding knife. Snapping open the blade with a firm click, he held it up to the dim light. The walls of the gut-like tunnel pressed in, nearly sealing off any escape. Without thinking, Myron drove the knife into the soft, pulsating floor and sliced downward. He pried open the wet edges of the gash. Thick mucus oozed from the wound like translucent blood, and blinding light burst into the tunnel, tearing through the darkness. As his eyes adjusted to the glow, he glimpsed a room below, empty, except for a man sitting at a desk, frantically hammering at the keys of a typewriter as if possessed. Then the tunnel convulsed with a violent spasm, and from deep within, a guttural roar erupted. Myron's cut had wounded the house. The shaft trembled, clenching in a crushing grip. Myron dove through the opening just as the walls of the tunnel, quivering with spasms, slammed shut behind him. He didn't see it. By then, he was already falling. He plummeted several meters and crashed onto the floor. Dazed, he lay still, blinking away the flashing lights in his vision until the world sharpened again. Through the white haze clouding his sight, a gray ceiling came into focus. A narrow hole gaped above him, the one he had fallen through, but only for a moment. Before his eyes, the wound in the ceiling sealed itself shut, mucus glistening as if healing over. Myron pushed himself up, rubbing his bruised side. He scanned the room, surprised to find it empty. The man at the typewriter had vanished. He was standing in a spacious chamber, bathed in blinding light. A massive panoramic window stretched across the entire wall, flooding the room with its eerie radiance. Myron's eyes welled up with tears, but he could still make out an incredible sight. Outside, snow was falling, its large flakes appearing gray against the pale clouds. which seemed to emit a muted glow. Somewhere on the edge of his consciousness, a memory flickered. Just last night, constellations of endless space had blazed beyond the house's walls. But Myron brushed it aside. He felt an eerie emotional detachment, as if anesthesia were slowly spreading through his scorched nerves, erasing anxiety, confusion, and fear. Only one thought remained in his mind. He had to find the source, the one mentioned by the girl and his double. Myron picked up the knife that had slipped from his grasp during the fall and approached the desk where the man had been sitting just moments ago. A sheet of paper was loaded into the carriage of an old typewriter, and Myron made out the printed lines. As if anesthesia were slowly spreading through his scorched nerves, erasing anxiety, confusion, and fear. Only one thought remained in his mind. He had to find the source, the one mentioned by the girl and his double. Myron picked up the knife that had slipped from his grasp during the fall and approached the desk where the man had been sitting just moments ago. A sheet of paper was loaded into the carriage of an old typewriter, and Myron made out. The final words blurred before his eyes. Myron, breathless with shock, gripped the edge of the desk. When the ringing in his head subsided and his heart stopped hammering against his ribs, he grabbed the stack of printed pages with trembling hands and flipped through them frantically. His gaze darted from line to line, catching sentences and paragraphs that described, in painstaking detail, every thought and action he had experienced since waking up on the floor of the empty room. Disbelieving, he reread the words printed on the paper in the typewriter. The text ended with the moment Myron had approached the desk. "I haven't decided what happens next yet," a quiet voice said behind him. Myron turned. Before him stood a short, middle-aged man with an unremarkable face, as if sculpted from dirty white clay. It was the kind of face one could see 100 times and still never remember a single defining feature. His forehead, nose, and chin all seemed blurred, melted, worn down. His small eyes were like cloudy glass marbles. Myron had no doubt. This was the same man he had seen typing at the desk. "Who are you?" Myron asked hoarsely. His mouth was dry, his voice weak, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. "I am the one they call the Source." The man introduced himself, stretching his thin lips into a smile. "The cause of all events and changes in your life." "What does that mean?" Myron instinctively tightened his grip on the knife's handle. To his surprise, the subtle movement did not escape the attention of the man calling himself the Source. He smirked and rolled his eyes theatrically. "You won't need that." The man shook his head. "Its appearance in the story is nothing more than a deus ex machina. I just didn't know how else to help you escape the tunnel. I've hit a complete dead end." The Source spread his hands, and Myron was stunned to see a look of genuine regret cross his face, as if he truly felt sorry for everything Myron had been through. "You've been watching me, writing down my every step." Myron gestured toward the stack of papers. "But how do you know my thoughts?" The Source grimaced and slowly closed his eyes, as if the conversation were giving him a headache. "You still don't understand." "Then what am I supposed to understand?" Myron snapped. "Are you one of them? One of those who are watching us?" "But why? What do you want?" The Source looked at Myron again, and this time his gaze turned razor-sharp, sharp enough to cut, if his eyes had been shards of ice. "I'm not watching," he said after a pause. "I'm creating, bringing stories to life on paper. But there is one tale that has haunted me for years. I just can't seem to finish it. I've thought about the plot and the characters, about you, so often that at some point, fiction began to feel like reality and reality like fiction. To be honest, I no longer know where one ends and the other begins." He exhaled, shaking his head. "I wasn't even surprised when you appeared before me, though maybe I should be questioning my sanity. After all, writers don't usually have conversations with their own fictional characters." His lips curled into a wry smile. Maybe I've lost my mind, he shrugged. Or maybe I haven't. He finally fell silent, and his words, reminiscent of a madman's ramblings, settled in Myron's mind like black soot. So you created me? Myron forced out with a nervous laugh, surprised by how absurd the question sounded. I'm just a figment of your imagination? The source spread his hands. Not just you. The entire house, its inhabitants, the Skreks, everything that was, is, and is yet to come. All of it exists only as I write it. A spasm tightened around Myron's throat, as if an invisible hand were squeezing his trachea. He barely managed to whisper, "And the girl? Did you invent her too?" A flicker of surprise crossed the source's eyes. The question seemed to catch him off guard, leaving him momentarily perplexed. "The girl?" he echoed, and without waiting for an answer, continued, "To be honest, I never really decided what role she should play in the story. I didn't even give her a name. Interesting that you asked about her." He walked over to the desk, pulled open a drawer, and rummaged through it before taking out a few sheets of paper. "This is one of the deleted scenes. I don't remember when I wrote it," the source said, handing the pages to Myron. "At one point, I wanted to give the girl a more active role in the story, but then I shifted my focus entirely to you, deciding she was better left as a secondary character." Myron scanned the text. It was difficult to read. Many lines and even entire paragraphs were crossed out. The letters danced before his eyes, refusing to form coherent words, and the words refused to form meaningful sentences. Frustrated, he gave up trying to make sense of it. Noticing his confusion, the source explained, "In this scene, the girl hides in the basement after a Skrek bursts into your room, while you manage to escape through the ventilation shaft. Like much of the story, this episode led nowhere, so I removed it. But I thought you might be interested to know what became of her." "Sounds like you're a terrible writer," Myron sneered, relishing the way the source flinched at his insolence. "Pointless running through corridors, cliché monsters, cheap riddles, ridiculous plot twists. Is that the best you can do? What's the point of all this?" He shook the pages with disdain. The source's face twitched with a nervous tick. Took him a moment to regain his composure. Then, with a crazed smile trembling on his lips, he replied, "I write because they enjoy it." "They?" Myron exploded, his hand involuntarily tightening around the knife. "Who are they?" The source raised his eyebrows in genuine surprise, and something about it made Myron uneasy. The man truly believed the delusional madness spilling from his fevered mind. Wild guesses exploded like galaxies in Myron's head, one after another. When the cacophony of thoughts finally subsided, he spoke in a quiet, drained voice. "They? You mean the readers?" The source nodded. "You exist as long as they are watching you. Right now, at this very moment, someone's eyes are tracing these lines, and that is why you live, breathe, hope." He paused and gestured toward the pages in Myron's hands. "Just as the girl existed while you were reading about her. But the moment they look away, you cease to be. Your life stops, until they return to the story to see what happens next." He tilted his head slightly, though that's not always the case. If a story is too boring, they abandon it, and then you disappear forever into the black void of oblivion. Something inside Myron cracked. A dull ache settled in his chest as he realized the bitter truth. His desperate struggle to escape this cursed house, infested with monstrous creatures, was nothing more than the whim of a pathetic hack, spinning a mediocre horror story for an audience that craved cheap thrills. In that case, there's no guarantee you aren't someone else's invention too, Myron said with a spiteful smirk, eager to wound his creator, if only a little. The source simply shrugged, as if the thought didn't surprise him in the least. "I've considered that," Maybe, at this very moment, someone is writing a story about me. A story about a failed writer who can't figure out an ending for his pathetic little tale. Myron mocked, savoring the way a shadow of irritation flickered across the source's face. That's exactly right, the source admitted, looking weary. I've rewritten this story so many times. Changed your name, your appearance, your personality, hoping it would push the plot forward. Dozens of times you've crawled through that tunnel, running from the Skreks, but I could never come up with a satisfying conclusion. Again and again, I abandoned the narrative and started over. His gaze darkened. I could do the same now, but they would be furious. No one likes a story without an ending. Myron wearily closed his eyes and quietly asked, "Why? What do you mean, why?" The source asked, puzzled. "Why am I crawling through the tunnel? Why do I want to escape the house? Why am I running from the Skreks? What is the purpose of all this?" Myron was surprised to see how his seemingly simple and obvious questions suddenly left the writer at a loss. The source absent-mindedly touched his chin, his gaze clouding over as if 100 thoughts were racing through his mind. "A good question, why?" He mused aloud. "I still don't understand your goal. You really are a terrible writer," Myron smirked. "You make me go through endless, pointless trials, and you don't even know why." His eyes fell to the pages still in his hand. A sudden realization struck him. He had never found out how the deleted scene with the girl ended. The source had said that his secondary character had hidden in the basement from the Skreks, but what happened next? Myron turned the page and caught sight of the final paragraph. His heart pounded violently as he read the fevered imaginings of a madman. The girl trembled with fear, clinging to the desperate hope that the darkness of the basement would protect her from the Skreks. Just as the silence reached its peak, becoming unbearably oppressive, a loud chittering sound shattered the stillness, and the shadows suddenly took shape. An enormous monster, which had been creeping toward its prey all along. She let out a blood-curdling scream, and that desperate cry became the signal for the attack. The creature pinned her to the ground, its claws raking through the flesh of her arms and legs. It loomed over her, mandibles spread wide, ready to sink its jagged teeth into her throat. The text ended abruptly. The source must have never decided whether to finish the girl off or let her live. Myron, his hands trembling, lifted his gaze to the writer, who was now grinning maniacally, his face alight with an unhinged, almost ecstatic joy, so genuine it was terrifying. "Why?" Myron choked out. "Why are you torturing her if you don't even need her?" Instead of answering, the source snatched the page from Myron's hand and, hurrying to his desk, fed the sheet into the typewriter with frantic excitement. "Now I know your purpose," he muttered under his breath, rubbing his hands nervously before positioning them over the keys. A damsel in distress, classic, but always effective. How did I not see it before? His fingers struck the typewriter keys feverishly, the metallic letters slamming against the page, imprinting new words in rapid succession. Myron never got to read them. In an instant, the pale light spilling through the panoramic window was snuffed out, as if swallowed by a wave of darkness. The room shrank, its sterile air replaced by a stale, putrid stench. A few seconds later, as the spots in his vision faded and a piercing scream shattered the silence, Myron realized he was in the basement, at the exact moment the Skrek attacked the girl. As if confirming his suspicion, a dim light flickered to life overhead, casting weak illumination over the scene. Myron saw the massive creature hunched over the girl, its jaws poised to snap shut around her throat. He didn't hesitate. In 2 swift steps, he lunged at the Skrek and, mid-leap, drove his knife into the monster's head with all his strength. The blade crunched through its chitinous skull, and a foul black ichor gushed from the wound. The Skrek shrieked in agony, lurching to the side. Myron, wild with fury, struck again and again, plunging the knife into the creature's head. The monster staggered on its crooked limbs, unable to escape the relentless assault. Finally, with one last wretched screech, the Skrek collapsed onto its side, its grotesque body convulsing as thick black blood pooled beneath it. Breathing heavily, Myron stood over the fallen beast for a few moments, making sure it was dead. Then, at last, he tossed aside the knife and rushed to the girl. She was already on her feet, pressed against the wall, fragile, terrified, her tear-filled eyes shimmering in the dim light. Thin streams of blood trickled from her wrists and soaked into the tattered fabric of her pants where the Skrek's claws had pinned her down. Myron wanted to say something, anything, to comfort the girl, but instead, he stepped closer and pulled her into a tight embrace. Her thin body trembled as if jolted by electricity, but after a few seconds in his arms, she began to calm down. She looked into his eyes and quietly asked, "Is this the end?" "I don't know." Myron swallowed the thick lump in his throat. "I hope so." When they emerged from the basement through a narrow door, they found themselves in a garden of barren trees. It surrounded the dark, looming house that had served as a prison for the characters of a deranged writer for what felt like an eternity. Myron didn't much care what had happened to the source, whether he had completely lost his mind, enraged by the escape of his own creations, or was still frantically hammering at his keyboard, struggling to keep pace with his fevered imagination. It no longer mattered, because Myron was holding the girl's hand, and the warmth of her palm filled him with both joy and peace. They walked in silence along the path winding through the lifeless forest. Words could not express what each of them felt. Soft flakes drifted gently from the sky, appearing gray against the backdrop of pale clouds. Only after a few minutes did Myron realize it was not snow, but ash, and he understood something else as well. He and the girl had nothing, and yet they had found the one thing that truly mattered.